Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to your Daily Penguin. This is our slow march of the penguins through my penguin wall, book by book, author by author. We are still in the ancient world. We are still plugging away at ancient Greece and Rome. Yesterday, in in a video in which I said uh, that a character in 2nd century BC Rome defeated Alexander the Great, so I don't blame a lot of you for turning off right then. It was a slip of the tongue. I meant Hannibal. I meant Hannibal and Zama. But yesterday we were talking about the playwright Terence and how, through a combination of good luck and a sharp brain and good looks, he found himself in the social circle in Rome of the son of the man who defeated Hannibal. The son of the man who defeated Hannibal was Scipio Aemilianus, and he was a bright young star. He was part of the very highest rung of Rome's social scene. And if you could get in his circle, then you would have access to the best publishers. You would have access to packed readings. You would have entree to have your work read at major festivals and occasions like that. And that's what happened to Terence. That's what gave Terence the platform from which to be famous and successful as a playwright in his day. And he wasn't the only one. That circle attracted lots of people, and I thought we'd stick with that circle for today and deal with a Greek, and that is Polybius, who was born around 200 BC and grew. He was born in influential circles into an influential family in ancient Greek politics at a time when the independence of ancient Greek politics, of the the various city-states and allegiances of city-states, was, unbeknownst to a lot of people, in its last flickering stages of independence, because a monster was growing in the Eastern Mediterranean. And that monster was Rome, and it brooked no independence. As it got bigger and bigger and bigger, it brooked no independence anywhere near it, even if that independence was benign. And by the time he was in early adulthood, Polybius was part of the Achaean League, which was a power source in the Greek world of the time period, and that meant, among other things, a guaranteed stay under house arrest in Rome. And that's where Polybius ended up. That's where he found himself, in Rome, as one of a group of exchanged hostages. And he fell in with Scipio's world, became a friend, maybe even to a certain extent a mentor to Scipio, and had access to an enormous amount of documents, and decided that he wanted to write a history of what was going on, of not only the overshadowing of the legendary and centuries-long independence of Greece, being overshadowed by this growing power of Rome, but the growing power of Rome itself. That itself was worth a history. And Polybius, I think, informally thought that Rome's first conflict with Carthage in the First Punic War, and victory in that war, was probably the big first step in that whole process happening. And that is kind of, in his mind, where his history should start. He has the Second Punic War very much in mind, and he has also what he would consider the present day in mind. But he wanted to start at an event that was just barely beyond the reach of actually sitting down and talking to people. In fact, not quite, because he's able to interview. It's clear in the course of reading this book that he interviewed people who remembered the Second Punic War, who remembered the active details, including old King Massinissa, who lived to a ripe old age and was a first-hand witness to a lot of the stuff that happened in the Second Punic War. And Polybius is remarkable not only because he had that as a historical framework that he wanted to hang his work on, but also because he understood that it was a valuable thing to talk to these people before they couldn't talk anymore, before they were gone. It's a mind frame that crops up all throughout this book, that is remarkable in how out of step it is with a lot of the historical practices of his day. Polybius is very much concerned with eyewitnesses. He's very much concerned with very primary stuff. He uses older historians and he uses extant historians the way every other historian does, and sometimes he tells us who he's using, and sometimes he doesn't. And sometimes he uses historian because they're the only person he has at his disposal that have written about X, Y, or Z, even though in the course of studying that historian and using them, he doesn't like them. He often criticizes historians that he is clearly relying on. And that stays true, that pattern stays true, because other later historians, including Livy and Plutarch, rely on Polybius and often mock him, often criticize him. But he was extremely well read. I mean, not he was. He was extremely well read. He had read a lot. But he was also himself. His books were read in future centuries, in future generations. And he influenced a lot of historians in telling these stories. And that influence is important because the pitiless ratio comes into play again with Polybius. He wrote, like, for instance, he wrote many, many works, not just an extended history of Rome's rise to power in the First Punic War and the Second Punic War and the Third Punic War, when Rome decided to go to Carthage in a totally unnecessary war and crush it and empty it and sack it and salt the earth. Scipio went along for that war, for the final siege, and he brought Polybius with him. This is a historian who not only valued first-hand accounts but also experienced them himself. And he wrote many other works in addition to this. He wrote biography, he wrote military treatises, he wrote personal stuff, tons and tons of collected letters, tons of them. But all of that is lost. But if we just concentrate on this book, this massive thing that he probably considered to be his masterpiece, his life's work, he wrote this in 40 segments, what we call 40 books. It is just one book. It is one artistic whole. But he wrote it in 40 segments. And of those 40 segments, 5 survive whole. And the rest in fragments. Or in not even fragments, in summaries from centuries later. So that's pretty bad. that's pretty harsh. And it's to Penguin's credit that they make this volume at all. This is a translation by Ian Scott Kilvert. And the translation is pretty good. And in his translator's preface, Scott Kilvert says what we've already encountered in your Daily Penguin many, many times, which is that the need for a new translation crops up in every generation. There's no such thing as a translation that just freezes its work in amber. Times change, usage changes, research changes, phrasing changes, and the dichotomy that is always present in translations between being accurate to the original and speaking to your present day, the interplay between those two poles changes as time passes. It's been a long time since this translation. This came out in the 1960s, I think. 1979. So that's been a long time. I think there's a more recent. I think Oxford World Classics has a more recent translation of Polybius. This is a very good one. Nothing wrong with it at all. In fact, Scott Kilvert has a sensitive enough ear so that he conveys not only the interest. There's as even my very brief summary should have given you the impression. Polybius is intensely interesting. We wish that we had everything. Even if this one work, we wish that we had everything. This is a man whose thinking about history is about as close to our own present-day conception of history as you can get in the ancient world. We notice the lapses, but they're very few. We notice the differences between our conception, which was largely born of German academics a century and 3/4 ago, between that idea of how to do history and what history is for. We notice the similarities between that and what Polybius thinks it's for right down the line. There are barely any. I mean, he doesn't do anything like a bibliography. He doesn't cite every source when he's clearly leaning on someone, but that's pretty minor compared to a mind frame that we haven't seen in, for instance, Suetonius or Tacitus or especially Livy. We haven't seen it in them. They've been writing history. Definitely. They've been writing their kind of history, but not our kind of history. And whereas Polybius makes it explicit. Let me read you a bit from Ian Scott Kilvert's translation so you can see what I mean. Here he's talking about one of the examples that I want to talk about where you're leaning on a historian. You're basically copying and brushing up what they wrote, but you're also bashing them the whole time. In this case, it's a Greek historian called Phylarchus, who, as far as I know, does not survive even in fragments. But Polybius stops for a minute to talk about the problems that he has with Phylarchus. Let's see here. In his eagerness to arouse the pity of his readers and enlist their sympathy, through his story, he introduces graphic scenes of women clinging to one another, tearing their hair and baring their breasts, and in addition he describes the tears and lamentations of men and women accompanied by their children and aged parents as they are led away into captivity. Phylarchus reproduces this kind of effect again and again in his history, striving on each occasion to recreate the horrors before our eyes. Let us ignore for the moment the ignoble and unmanly nature of his treatment of the subject, and consider the nature and use of history itself. It is not a historian's business to startle his readers with sensational descriptions. Nor should he try, as the tragic poets do, to represent speeches which might have been delivered, or to enumerate all the possible consequences of the events under consideration. It is his task first and foremost to record with fidelity what actually happened and was actually said. However commonplace this may be, for the aim of tragedy is by no means the same as that of history, but rather the opposite. The tragic poet seeks to thrill and charm his audience for the moment by expressing through his characters the most plausible words possible, but the historian's task is to instruct and persuade serious students by means of the truth of the words and actions he represents, and this effect must be permanent, not temporary. Thus, in the first case, the supreme aim is probability, even if what is said is untrue, the purpose being to beguile the spectator. But in the second, it is truth, the purpose being to benefit the reader. You can see what I mean. It's a little bit stodgy. Polybius is a little bit stodgy. He's not Livy by any means on a couple of different levels. But that's virtually our own conception of the aim of history and the things it should and shouldn't do. That's fascinating to me, and that comes through here. This Penguin Classic is a little bit frustrating. The editor, who edits this, F.W. Walbank. The editor says in his introduction, if I remember correctly, that the size of the volume prohibited translating all of every bit of what we have that's left of this work by Polybius. All of the summaries, all the fragments, and all of the whole work. We're told that, but I don't see it. Obviously, you can look over my shoulder and see there are many Penguin Classics that are longer than this. Why this is the only chance that you're ever going to have to get Polybius into a massive audience, into every book. Once upon a time, Penguin Classics were in every bookstore. Why wouldn't you translate the whole of it? Why wouldn't you give us everything that we have left? It's not that much more than this book. Probably a third more that would be all of it. And it's annoying, I would imagine, for one of those serious students. It'd be annoying to come across that mention in the introduction to this work and just spend the whole of your time reading it wondering what you're not reading, wondering what the editor and translator decided not to include. But we wouldn't have it gone. I am. This is a strong recommend. You have to put up with. The translator here is very accurate. You could probably tell even from that excerpt that I read that Polybius is fond of balanced periods. He's fond of academic duplicate speech, which is true even today. Academics in their own writing duplicate everything to notice and be aware of, to see and perceive, to stop and take stock. If you read a typical academic production, every single verb and noun will be doubled. Just out of reflex. They don't need to be at all. They're just out of reflex. And Polybius is very much that kind of a writer. In his Greek is nothing to write home about. So that might explain. I would hate to think it, but nevertheless, the fact that his Greek was not showroom Greek might explain why no one thought to save these things, or no one thought to save more of his books, of what he wrote. Because a lot of the people who were involved at those key pinch points in that ended up determining what we get and what we don't get, had different priorities. They weren't thinking, well, I'm looking around, this library loft that's covered in cobwebs and has a hole in the ceiling over at that end that's destroying all the books underneath it. I'm looking at this library, and I know the contents of it really well, and I know off the top of my head that there's no other writer from the ancient world writing about anything like this. We, standing at the doorway of that library archive would say, well, then that means that makes him more important than ever to save everything. That person, at the very beginning of the Italian Renaissance, or even a little bit before that, might have looked and said, well, yes, he's the only person writing on that subject, but what does that matter? What matters is how he's doing it, and there are a whole bunch better stylists here, so I'll save them, and not him. anyway, that is your Daily Penguin for today. That is Polybius. Roman history that we could not do without, Roman history that later Roman historians couldn't do without. And I believe we will now be moving on from the social circle of Scipio Aemilianus. There are only so many poet tasters and second-rate historians that he can put on the payroll. So I think we'll move on tomorrow. But I will reconvene, and we'll see you then. Thank you, BookTube.